Pokémon Legends Z-A reviews are finally out, and in this video I wanted to not only give you a rundown of what the critics are saying and the general consensus of how good or bad the game is, but to also compare its reviews and the praise and complaints it's received against reviews that were written for relevant past games at the time. We're talking Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, the most recent and current mainline games of the series, as well as Pokémon Legends Arceus, which was Pokemon's first foray into this new Legends format. I've been very busy looking back over lots of reviews of Scarlet and Violet and Legends Arceus to have a solid understanding of how critics felt about them at launch. I'll be looking at how the new Legends Z-A reviews compare, and therefore going through with you whether or not it seems like, based on your experience and your enjoyment of Scarlet and Violet and Legends Arceus, whether Z-A sounds like it'll be a good fit for you. A quick note before I start, just to say a huge thank you to everyone who's watched this recent video of mine that explores everything you need to know about Legends Z-A before playing the game. The response has just been absolutely overwhelming, and the comments you've been leaving me have just been so kind. If you haven't seen it yet, I'll leave a link to this in the description so that you can check it out after this video. But for now, let's dive in. Okay, so let's kick things off by seeing exactly what the critics are saying about Legends Z-A. I've pulled out a few quotes from some of the top, most trusted gaming review publications out there, so I'll quickly read through a few of these before we get on to comparing them to the games gone by. Okay, I'm going to start things off with VGC, partly because their review was sort of glowing, really. They gave the game a 5 out of 5 and said, Pokémon Legends Z-A is a grand adventure that once again proves that the Legends series is home to the most interesting ideas Game Freak has. It's a game that understands its audience and feels like a love letter to both players who grew up with X and Y and those who have been here the whole time. The new battle system really worked for me, and the rogue mega battles are bombastic fun, even if, like the traditional turn-based offering, it can get very easy as you level up your team. I hope the Pokémon Legends series is here to stay. Now, elsewhere in that review, VGC also praised the setting of Lumio City, describing it as being bright and full of Pokémon to catch. It praises the soundtrack, saying it's the best orchestral Pokémon soundtrack ever, which excites me personally, and interestingly notes how Game Freak finally trusts fans with a more mature tone, which is very intriguing. The one downside that VGC talk about is the fact that they feel it's obvious that the game being on Switch 1 and Switch 2 has held the Switch 2 version back. If that's the case, that is a bit of a shame. Moving on to a quote from Eurogamer, who, rather than 5 out of 5, gave the game 3 out of 5. It's a mix of older ideas with new ones, and one that arguably finds the most enjoyable balance yet. And it also feels a little abridged, a little self-contained. It's a bridging game in a way, which these Legends games were probably always meant to be, between the main series ones. A breezy, charming, in-between entry that could argue its limits needn't be a problem if only the games it was arriving between were a little sturdier. Once again, as with so much of the past 6 or 7 years as a Pokémon fan, we're still stuck with imagining, but at least as proof of concepts go, I'm now convinced this one could really work. Essentially here, Eurogamer is saying that, as opposed to VGC, they feel that Lumio City could be improved, and it really leans heavily on this idea that it's a great proof of concept, but should be pushed further. Moving on to Nintendo Life, who gave the game a 7 out of 10. Pokémon Legends Z-A should be celebrated for its fabulous real-time combat and its largely smooth jump to the Switch 2. But in condensing things down to one single location, it loses part of the Pokémon magic that Arceus and many other entries managed to amplify. I'll forever find filling up my Pokédex fun, and for the Switch 2 generation, this is a good starting point for the franchise. But if the Legends series is to continue, it needs to recapture its personality and fuse that real-time system with a bit more freedom. Now, this review leans quite heavily into the idea that the battling, the new real-time combat, is really fun. It also mentions the performance on Switch 2, saying that it's almost a constantly stable 60 frames per second. But it also highlights how it feels that the new wild zones and the visuals of the game are all a bit flat and a bit lifeless, and that with Lumio City being the single setting of the game, that feels a bit restrictive. Okay, just a couple more. We'll go to Games Radar next, who gave the game a 4 out of 5, saying Pokémon Legends Z-A offers a true slice-of-life Pokémon experience thanks to its anime-style real-time combat system and wholesome world-building elements. While its single city setting can sometimes feel a bit samey, Lumiose is densely packed with things to do and discover. This is a world worth getting lost in. Again, this review really highlighted the combat, the new battle system, as well as the music, and also similarly, it talks about how the single setting of Lumiose City is quite restrictive. The one thing I did notice in this review, which is a bit frustrating for me personally, is it does mention that there is a lack of interactive buildings, which I just feel is something that Pokemon has lost over the last few years, and I really want it to go back to having buildings you can walk into and interacting with NPCs inside, but it seems that isn't the case. Finally, we go to IGN. This is a review in progress, so it hasn't been given a score yet. Pokémon Legends Z-A, at least across the first 24 hours, is putting a lot of my fears to rest. It's not revolutionary by any stretch, but it's really good. I'm having fun, I'm excited to keep playing, I feel rewarded for exploring every corner, the story's got my attention, and I'm not distracted by my Pokemon falling through the floor while they battle or everything crashing when I try to climb a ladder. If the rest of my adventure holds up and the Switch 1 performance isn't a disaster, we could finally have a 3D game worthy of the Pokemon franchise on our hands. So again, I feel a more promising sounding review there, perhaps more in line with the VGC review from the start. It kind of fills me with a lot of hope, which is a good thing. So let's now compare the general themes and what the reviewers seem to be saying in the Legends Z-A reviews to what was said about Pokemon Scarlet and Violet when their reviews launched a few years ago. For reference, just for anyone who's unaware, Scarlet and Violet are the most recent traditional mainline games and are therefore really the sort of benchmark or the comparison point of where the Pokemon series is right now. But you may well remember from Scarlet and Violet's launch back in 2022 that the games had a relatively rough time of it when reviews were first published. If you played the games yourself at launch, or at least on original Switch hardware, then you probably know why. We will start with the positives though. Scarlet and Violet were widely praised in their reviews for daring to transition into an open world format for the first time and offering freedom that we hadn't really seen before, largely thanks to the non-linear way you can tackle the game's various objectives and the multiple story branches that the games offered. That isn't something that you'd usually associate with the Pokemon game, and reviewers really appreciated it. Comparing that to what we're hearing about Legends Z-A, and on the one hand, I'm a little concerned. It seems from these reviews that we're quite limited in Legends Z-A. A fair few reviewers noted how Lumiose City being the only location feels a bit restrictive, but on the other hand, I personally felt that Scarlet and Violet's open world felt a bit too empty. And I'd personally much rather have a smaller location that has lots to do and feels full of life than have a huge open expanse to explore but with nothing really in it. So hopefully the right decision has been made. Another key plus point mentioned in the Scarlet and Violet reviews at the time was the story itself and the game's cast of characters who each have more compelling and perhaps more mature storylines and narratives than some past games. I do remember reaching the end of Scarlet and Violet myself and thinking that the story wrapped up in a pretty decent way and was maybe a bit more memorable actually than some of the games gone by. Now, the story and its plot is obviously something that reviewers wouldn't want to and probably wouldn't be allowed to share too much of as part of their embargo agreements for Legends Z-A, but from the few mentions of the story I have seen, I am quite hopeful. A couple of outlets have talked about this story also being quite mature. One of them said something about it being tinged with a bit of nostalgia too, and I personally like Pokemon games to be brave enough to tackle more mature themes. And finally, reviewers of Scarlet and Violet also really liked the game's new innovations. So we're talking things like the strategy and battle depth offered by terrestrialization, which was a new battle gimmick introduced in Scarlet and Violet, which amongst other things can temporarily change a Pokemon's typing in battle, as well as things like having more seamless movement and riding on Pokemon, which actually has done a bit before as well, but Scarlet and Violet definitely took that to new levels. Obviously, with Legends Z-A, the big new innovation is the new battle system, and I'm really pleased to see that pretty much every review I read really seemed to click with the new combat system. All of the Legends Z-A reviews I've just read definitely praise the combat and sort of suggest that the fundamentals of catching and battling Pokemon remain the game's strongest point. So for anyone wondering how the new real-time battling mechanic might play out, it seems like all is good. Now, the downsides of Scarlet and Violet, and what almost every single review from back then that I've looked over for this video was saying, is that the technical performance of the games, so frame rates, clipping, glitches, and just generally underwhelming graphics and rough textures, all of that is particularly poor. For a lot of reviewers, the technical issues were enough to take away from the fun and from the good points that we've just been discussing. It was a huge, very common theme throughout almost every review at the time. With Legends Z-A, I'm getting the impression from these reviews that it's definitely not going to be a technical marvel by any means, but it is at least a significant improvement, by the sounds of it, over Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. A few outlets have mentioned that it's visually a little lacking, that it still feels a touch outdated, which is frustrating, but it does at least seem like an improvement from where we've been recently. It's also worth noting that all of the reviews are based on the Switch 2 edition of the game as opposed to the Switch 1. There's really quite little information out there about how the game does run on the Switch 1 at the moment, which is slightly concerning. Hopefully more will come out about that over the next couple of days. I think the other most common complaint that I noticed in the Pokémon Scarlet and Violet reviews was, I don't really know how to put this, but sort of missed potential. There was a lot of talk of the game's open world nature and the whole non-linear thing, you know, being able to take on whichever story path in whichever order you wanted, but I think the frustration came from those things just not being as fun or rewarding as they maybe should have been. There's very little reason to actually go out of your way and do things in a different order, especially when wild Pokemon and trainers don't adapt to your level, and instead you end up being too weak to take on some areas and then too overpowered in others. In the Legends Z-A reviews, I do unfortunately feel like we're seeing a sort of similar thought pattern. Taking the Nintendo Life review as an example, it talks about how the game is a good starting point for Pokemon on Switch 2 and that what it does well, but that by reducing the game to a single location, it loses some of the exploration magic that Pokemon's all about. I think it sounds similar to Scarlet and Violet in the sense that that game was, oh great, we have this fully open world to explore and it works mostly, but it's not as fun as it should be. The thing is though, this is obviously a point that's really subjective, and I think the most important thing here is that we'll all discover this for ourselves when we get our hands on the game and we can decide for ourselves. To wrap up the Scarlet and Violet comparison, here are the overall aggregated Metacritic scores. This is essentially an average of all top critic reviews put into one number. So Legends Z-A at the time of me filming this, which is on the day the first reviews went live, so this could change quite quickly, but it's currently sitting on a score of 81. In comparison, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet received a score of 72 and 71 respectively. So we can see that there is a decent jump in scores here already. So far, mostly so good. So let's move on to Legends Arceus and how the Legends Z-A reviews compare to that game. Legends Arceus was a bit of a different beast. It actually launched earlier in 2022, so the same year that Scarlet and Violet came out, but was definitely seen in a much more positive light at the time, and looking back over all the reviews now, you can still really see just how much reviewers enjoyed their time with it. I think the two main positive points from Arceus were, again, its innovation, the fact that it took this series in a new direction, which reviewers were quite consistently saying was a much needed change, particularly how the game struck a balance between keeping the core of what Pokemon is but blending it with new mechanics that really did fit quite nicely, and also the world itself, the game's setting, you know, its environments, how the wild Pokemon behave within the environment, and even the art style and the music. It was all, much more often than not, praised as being a really strong part of the game. With the Legends Z-A reviews, we can clearly see that once again the game has gone in this new innovative direction, and reviewers do seem to really love that part of the game, the new battle system, etc. So it does seem that just like Legends Arceus, the things that Legends Z-A is doing that are new are really good. I would say though that all the praise Legends Arceus received for its environments and locations have essentially been used against Legends Z-A in these new reviews. Critics talk about how going from Arceus to Z-A's one location feels restrictive, with most of them feeling that it is a bit of a downgrade. I did touch upon this in the previous positive point about Legends Arceus, but just to particularly highlight it, the Legends Arceus reviews really made quite a big deal about the new mechanics, the new ways you could catch Pokemon in the wild by sneaking around and approaching them, and how battles take place and how natural that all felt, with everything being much more seamlessly integrated into the world itself rather than relying on the usual turn-based encounters from your more traditional mainline game. It's definitely one of the things that makes the Legends games stand apart. And I think this point is where the Legends Z-A reviews are the most similar to the Legends Arceus ones. I won't go on about it too much because I've mentioned it a few times already now, but it's definitely the battle system, the new real-time combat, and this whole new take on what Pokemon battling can be that seems to be the highlight of Legends Z-A. As for what reviewers didn't like about Legends Arceus a few years ago, there isn't a whole lot. The criticisms were usually sort of buried closer to the bottom of the reviews, saying that, yeah, this wasn't perfect, but overall, don't worry about it. And these complaints were mostly a few issues with technical performance again. Obviously, Pokemon games have never really been at the forefront of gaming when it comes to performance, and also a few complaints about some of the missions and tasks feeling repetitive, and how they're not so much tied into the story, but just additional stuff you're made to do just for the sake of it. Again, I think the Legends Z-A reviews are quite similar. Reviewers have noted similar sort of disappointing technical things, but not quite on the same level as the Legends Arceus reviews, and definitely nowhere near the same level as the Scarlet and Violet reviews. But I guess Legends Z-A does have a few more complaints overall, thanks to the limit on scale that the game seems to have. I think overall then, it's quite clear to see that Legends Z-A and Legends Arceus do share a lot of similarities. Not just in their gameplay, but also how they've been received by critics. But I'm leaning towards feeling that, on the whole, reviewers seem to have slightly enjoyed Legends Arceus just that little bit more than Legends Z-A. So, as for the aggregated review scores, as we know, Legends Z-A is currently sitting on 81, and Legends Arceus has an overall review score of 83. Very similar at this stage. We'll have to see how Legends Z-A review score shifts over the coming days. Now, at the start of all this, I mentioned that I wanted to dedicate a final segment of the video to looking over whether or not Pokemon Legends Z-A seems like it'll be a good fit for you based on your experiences with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet and Legends Arceus. I think the first point here is that if you're someone who was put off Scarlet and Violet because of the game's performance, technically, and that's something that's important to your enjoyment, then Legends Z-A is a definite step up. It's never going to be the sort of standard you'd expect from a top tier PS5 game, for example, but it sounds like any disappointments it does have in the graphics department are relatively minor, which is really great news. If you loved Scarlet and Violet though, on the other hand, then I'd just be aware that Legends Z-A does sound like a very different game. Obviously, the real-time combat will be different for everyone, but also going from the size that Paldea was, the region in Scarlet and Violet, to a much more condensed setting in Legends Z-A, that might have an impact on how you feel about things. I personally wouldn't let it put you off too much though, because as I say, I would definitely take a condensed area that's full of things to do over a big wide open space that just has you running around for hours. As for those who have played Legends Arceus, I think it's quite clear to see that the two games do share quite a lot of the same DNA. I think if you enjoyed Arceus, it definitely sounds like you'll enjoy Legends Z-A too. It's just worth noting that some of the few differences it does have are quite big ones. The combat, the change of location, they definitely sound like they'll feel noticeably different, and I personally think it'll actually be interesting for Legends Arceus players to experience that difference. I guess we'll see how well it all translates when we get our hands on the game ourselves. I'd just like to quickly remind you about my recent video, which offers a deep dive into all the character backstories and game history that have led us to the point of Pokemon Legends Z-A. The video is designed to help you get the absolute most out of your Z-A playthrough, so if you are planning on buying the game, I would urge you to give that a watch. The link is in the description. Please also consider subscribing to the channel if you liked the video and you want to see more like this. I'll be sharing more videos on Pokemon Legends Z-A over the coming weeks as the game launches and as we get our hands on it. If there's any particular type of video you'd really like to see, then by all means leave your suggestions in the comments and I'll give those a good read through. And I think that's about that. So thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next one.